York Times on April 27, 2003 reported on 5 people who had lost their jobs during the previous 12 months. One of them, Mr. Mike Guido, an unemployed product engineer from Pittsburgh, summarised his experiences by saying, "The economy has sideswiped me." I don't think Mr. Guido is alone. Many people, and in fact some entire countries, feel like the economy has sideswiped them. While some people appear to be doing very well, an increasing number of others feel they are missing out on the benefits of what is often called economic development. For some, it's the speed with which the world of work is changing which causes them distress. Each new technological development seems to accelerate the pace of change. My cell phone now knows where I am everywhere in the world, and people are often offended if they can't contact me when they want to. And the increasingly volatile global marketplace within which many companies have to operate means change seems to be pressing in from every direction. For many, however, the problem is bigger than simply the rate of change. Many people feel totally overwhelmed by the number of different directions in which the working world is changing simultaneously. First of all, how work is done is changing in many different ways. Here are 8 examples. Full-time jobs are not being replaced as fast as they are being destroyed. Almost all of the increase in jobs in most countries of the world is in part-time, contract or temporary jobs. Less than 30% of jobs in the developed world are involved with the manipulation of real physical things. More than 2/3 of job holders only manipulate information about real things. Entry-level qualification requirements for virtually all jobs are increasing constantly. As fast as one developing country attracts the attention of global companies, new regions open themselves up to the world and offer incentives to relocate. Hours worked by full-time job holders are increasing steadily, despite the promise of technologically inspired increased leisure time. Payment for time worked outside normal hours is reducing, which means disposable income is actually decreasing in many cases. And the gap between the richest countries and the poorest has more than doubled in the past 40 years. In a publication of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, in the year 2000, authored by Mr. Viv Pitsia and entitled "The Effects of Globalization on World Income Equality," it was reported that in 1960, per capita GDP of the richest 20 countries was 14 times the poorest 20. By 1998, it was 34 times. In every country in the world, both official and unofficial unemployment is either steadily increasing or has reached an unacceptably high level, which doesn't seem to be able to be reduced, no matter which economic policies are implemented. And when work is done is also changing, as consumers everywhere are expecting 24-hour service and product availability. This means the span of hours during which people are expected to work is steadily approaching the maximum of 168 hours per week. where work is being done is also changing, as multinational companies are getting bigger at the same time as small business is increasing the percentage of the workforce which it employs. And both are encouraging employees to do their work outside of conventional office buildings. Even who is working is changing, as women, ethnic minorities, the elderly and the disabled are all seeking jobs where once they would have been considered to be outside the labour force. All of these are important, and discussing the implications of each of them could take this entire broadcast. In fact, we've spoken about many of them in previous programs. But for me, there's a deeper reason why so many people are struggling to come to terms with the changing world of work. And that has to do with why we work. By the time many of us were born, the idea that adult males went to work was completely entrenched in our experience. We understood that this was how our economy functioned. Men worked full-time to produce the goods which kept the economy moving and to earn the money which supported their wives, their families and their communities. These were pretty compelling reasons for going off to work. And even if the work itself was boring, many generations of men happily went off to work each day, believing they were doing their bit for themselves, for their families, and for their country. All of the trends I mentioned earlier are undermining this picture of how the world works. And as a result, many people are beginning to question why they go to work. An increasing number of individuals are saying, whether they're conscious of it or not, there must be more to my life than my job, which at a societal level translates as there's more to life than economics. Everybody knows this is true. We all want to believe that our lives amount to more than the output we create for the boss. But the material success which economics and jobs have provided over the past 100 years has lulled us into forgetting this reality. As I see it, much of the turmoil in the current world of work can be explained by understanding this shift in the way in which individuals and communities are thinking and feeling. Let me explain this by taking just the first of the examples I gave earlier, the fact that full-time jobs are disappearing and being replaced by more contingent forms of work. The notion of a full-time job initially emerged as the Industrial Revolution spawned huge factories and mines, which required many more workers than any single workplace had ever required before. Over the subsequent 200 years, the full-time job has become entrenched in our collective psyche through such slogans as 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure and 8 hours sleep, which was a motto used by trade unions in many countries of the world while lobbying for a reduction in the standard working day. As I said earlier, by the time most of us were born, the idea that an adult male went to work was well entrenched in our experience. In addition, our whole education system evolved to focus on providing young men with the opportunity to get a good job. This was such an apparently attractive goal that it drove much of the feminist movement from the 1960s to seek access to these good jobs for the women who'd been largely excluded from them until then. And in recent years, vocational education has focused as much on creating job opportunities for young women as for their brothers. The same goal of providing good full-time jobs has driven much of what has come to be called economic development, as the second and third world sought to catch up with the first. Conceptually, this idea is very appealing. One spends 1/3 of one's life engaged in economic production on the job, and thus secures the income to enjoy the other 2/3 of life. So why, as we enter the 21st century, have we begun to see these so-called good full-time jobs disappearing? The first reason is relatively obvious, though still vehemently denied by most politicians and economists, and that is that we simply don't need as many people in 2005 as we once did to produce what we need. There simply aren't as many jobs needed to be filled by people as there are people who want them. This is one promise on which technological advancement has actually delivered. Notice that I'm not saying there's a shortage of work to be done, merely that the proportion of work which does need doing, that can easily be packaged into a job, is decreasing. I shall have more to say about this at the conclusion of this program. But there are other more subtle reasons as well why full-time jobs are disappearing. Firstly, from a societal perspective, the regimen of the full-time job created central business districts and their huge impersonal office towers, peak-hour traffic jams, pollution and massive resource costs, not to mention the time wasted commuting to and from work. It is hardly surprising that as awareness of these costs has increased, ways to minimise them has been experimented with. And one profound way to reduce these societal costs is to increase the variety of places and ways in which work is done. In my home country, we don't speak of central business districts anymore. We seek instead to convert office towers into apartments and to attract people to live closer to where they work. And just as fast, we're building ring roads which take people around our central cities to an ever-increasing number of satellite cities where they can live, work and play. And many of the jobs in these satellite centres require shift work or are otherwise adjusted to fit the lifestyles of those who live there. As well, from the perspective of the employer, taking on a full-time employee is a risky prospect. There are legal liabilities, on costs and other employee benefits, not to mention the obligation on the employer to provide enough work to keep the employee occupied and justify the salary. From this perspective, the hiring of more contingent employees makes more sense, and we can see this happening everywhere. From the perspective of the employee, the security and stability of a full-time job might be very appealing, but too often the job has been boring, unfulfilling, and provided little opportunity for personal growth, even if it's paid a living wage. And as organisations have steadily reduced the number of their full-time employees, the work to be done has been divided among those who are left, thus increasing their working hours and their stress levels. And as people's lifestyles have become more diverse and their family obligations more complex, the full-time job has proved to be very inflexible and life unfriendly. 40 years ago, the number of part-time jobs was very small. Hence, if you wanted work, you virtually had to take a full-time job. In Australia today, part-time jobs make up over a third of all jobs, a quite typical figure around the world. And hence, those who find the full-time job too constraining have plenty of other options, and they're increasingly taking them. I could go on, but this highlights just how unstable the current world of work is, and it demonstrates just why so many people are struggling to cope. But it's not all bad news. An increasing number of corporations and institutions are coming to terms with these new workplace dynamics and operating successfully, both in terms of their business goals and also from the perspective of their employees. In another module, I'll suggest ways in which individuals, companies and institutions can successfully navigate their way through this frenzied world of work. However, to finish the first part of this presentation, it would be wrong to ignore the many commentators who are very concerned about the consequences of these changes on the way society functions. For example, in The Brave New World of Work, German sociologist Ulrich Beck describes what he and others have called the Brazilianization of the West, and anticipates the creation of 4 groups of people in future Western societies. At the top of the heap are what he calls the Columbus class of the global age. These are the winners from globalization, the owners of active capital, the money and knowledge elites. They have the technological and material resources of globalization at their command, but they pay a high price for this in terms of time poverty. Their numbers are increasing slightly in most countries, but their share of the wealth of the world is increasing much more rapidly. Second are precarious employees at the top of the skills ladder. These people earn a lot, but need to be constantly vigilant to ensure that they're not pushed aside by their rivals. They have little time for leisure or social activities, as they're on call virtually 24 hours a day. The number of people in this category seems to be relatively stable, with some losing out to technological change at about the same rate as others benefit from the development of new industries. Next is the working poor. The jobs for which these people are most skilled are those most directly threatened by globalization and automation. These people are most likely to be part of the contingent workforce, dipping into several employment situations at once, yet still struggling to meet their living costs. Numbers in this category are increasing in all first world countries. Finally is a group which is excluded from traditional labour force data. Those people who do not have a job and have long since stopped looking for one. They're part of the grey economy, surviving on the streets and excluded from the characteristics of modern life, such as public education, decent healthcare, social security and the right to vote. It is a fear of increase in the size of this group to which Beck refers when he speaks of Brazilianisation, since Brazil and many other South American countries have lived with significant numbers of these people for many years. The number of people in these latter two categories already represents the majority in many so-called developing countries, a reality which underpins much political instability. If Beck is right to fear a similar increase in the first world, this presents a particular challenge to their political stability. I don't discount the importance of this analysis. At the very least, it highlights the extent to which the global perspective tends to dominate in discussions such as these. In an increasingly connected world, I guess this is hardly surprising. However, as this graphic indicates, even in Latin America, exports account for less than 1/4 of total economic production. Or, to put that another way, more than 3/4 of the work done in Latin America is done by the local population for the local population. In this context, it makes sense to focus more attention on what works at the domestic level than to be too distracted by what appear to be global trends. I hope this other graphic for the US also puts into context a dubious modern trend towards believing that everything in the world must be world class. Where export substitution is likely or even possible, it makes sense to be aware of what's happening in the rest of the world. But when more than 3/4 of production is for local consumption, it's entirely up to the locals to decide what is appropriate. And if it makes cultural sense to do things in a particular way for a local population, then this is an entirely sufficient reason for doing things just that way. That brings me to the end of this module. In another module, I'll focus on some of the initiatives which successful organisations are using to ease transition into this exciting new world of work.